What is the worst Beatles song of all time? Revolution 9 is a popular choice, but anyone who's seen my video kind of digging into that song will know I actually think it's raucous, strange and abrasive, but also brilliant. The worst Beatles song of all time, in my opinion, however, also is from that same album, the White Album. And it's this one, track 5, Wild Honey Pie. It's just 53 seconds long, and the lyrics consist of Paul McCartney screeching the words honey pie 8 times and then saying I love you honey pie at the end. And that's it. The other day I heard Wild Honey Pie again while doing a listen through of the White Album, and this time I decided I wanted to do a bit of digging. I've heard it so many times and kind of winced my way through it, but never really dug into the backstory to see why on earth it's there, or if it means anything. Why does Paul McCartney, who plays every instrument on the track, keep screeching about honey pie? The first clue in the trail of breadcrumbs was this interesting comment from the book many years from now. McCartney said of this song, "We were in an experimental mode, and so I said, can I just make something up? I started off with the guitar and did a multi-tracking experiment in the control room. I just made up this short piece and I multi-tracked a harmony to that, and a harmony to that, and a harmony to that, and built it up sculpturally with a lot of vibrato on the guitar strings, really pulling the strings madly. Hence, Wild Honey Pie, which was a reference to the other song I had written called Honey Pie." Now that, particularly the last sentence, was interesting to me. This song was not just some mad little standalone moment, it was in fact a reference to another song on the White Album, just called Honey Pie. So here was somewhere else I could do a little more digging. I decided to take a look at that song as well to see if there were any clues there that might help me decode what Wild Honey Pie and Honey Pie are actually about. Here are the lyrics to Honey Pie. "She was a working girl, north of England way. Now she's hit the big time in the USA. And if she could only hear me, this is what I'd say. Honey Pie, you are making me crazy. I'm in love, but I'm lazy, so won't you please come home? Honey Pie, my position is tragic. Come and show me the magic of your Hollywood song. You became a legend of the silver screen, and now the thought of meeting you makes me weak in the knee. Honey Pie, you are driving me frantic. Sail across the Atlantic to be where you belong. Honey Pie, come back to me. Kindly send her sailing back to me." So, Honey Pie is clearly a character, a female actress for whom Paul McCartney has a bit of a fondness, a little bit of a soft spot. And at this point when I was researching the video, I began to wonder, is this about a real person? It is at least a possibility. I decided to see if Paul McCartney had at any point explained the song in any greater depth, or given any clue as to its subject and origins. Here's a little more from the book Many Years From Now. Paul says, "Both John and I had a great love for music hall, what the Americans call vaudeville. I very much liked that old crooner style, the strange fruity voice that they used. So, Honey Pie was me writing one of them to an imaginary woman across the ocean on the silver screen, who was called Honey Pie. It's another one of my fantasy songs." So, Paul denies that it's about an actual person. This is an imaginary character. But Paul McCartney has denied the true meaning of many songs down through the years, only to admit to them later on in life. A good example is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. He insisted that song wasn't about drugs for years, only to admit later, well, that one was an obvious drug reference. And so, even though I'm a massive Beatles fan, and even though Paul is my favourite Beatle, I do know that we have to take some of his song explanations just with a little pinch of salt sometimes. I looked again at the lyrics to this song and thought, if on the off chance it was actually written about a real person, could I, at the very least, find a good candidate for who it could have been about? Could there be someone out there with the dubious honour of having the worst Beatles song of all time written about them? To get some further clues, my next step was to try and figure out when the song was written. If you can find out what was going on in the life and world and culture of the songwriter at the time a song was written, You can sometimes get a couple of clues from this context. However, because in the opinion of many fans, Honey Pie is an example of what Lennon disparagingly called Paul McCartney's granny music, this song does not have a great deal of background information written about it compared to many of the other songs in the Beatles canon. We do, however, know that Paul had Wild Honey Pie, which refers to this track, when the band were in Rishikesh in India in February 1968. According to the Beatles Bible, Wild Honey Pie was a solo recording by Paul McCartney, a sing-along written in Rishikesh, India, and recorded at the end of the session for Mother Nature's son. And there's a quotation that says, "Wild Honey Pie was just a fragment of an instrumental which we were not sure about, but Patty Harrison liked it very much, so we decided to leave it on the album." So, let's put that in a timeline. February 1968 is the first reference we have to Wild Honey Pie, and that's in Rishikesh, India. Now, if you remember, in one of the previous quotes we've already looked at, Paul said he made the song up in the studio. But we've already seen that they actually had it in February, so here we have Paul perhaps remembering wrong, or perhaps being a little bit of an unreliable interviewee. So, the trail of breadcrumbs continues. We can trace the song's evolution by next having a look at where it had got to by May of that year. Because in May of that year, the band went to George Harrison's home to record the Isha demos for the White Album, and one of those songs was Honey Pie. And you can hear the May 1968 Isha demo of Honey Pie on the 2018 Super Deluxe version of the White Album. It's shorter than the finished version, and there's also big sections where McCartney is just kind of making up nonsense filler words because he hasn't got the lyrics yet. And we know it was completed by the first week of October 1968 when it was recorded. So there you can see the time span over which the two songs were written, probably over 9 to 10 months in 1968. So, now that we've established the time period and the context in which the song was written, we have to look for a candidate. Is there a real-life woman out there who could have been the inspiration behind the character of Honey Pie? I think, for me personally, for someone to successfully qualify, they have to fulfil the following 5 criteria. Firstly, they need to be a female from the north of England. They need to be an actress, a famous movie star who's done work in Hollywood. They need to be a singer who has ideally sung in their movies. They need to have some kind of clear connection to Paul McCartney. And they need to have some kind of clear connection to the name Honey Pie. And so, now it's time for the grand reveal. Firstly, I am going to present my candidate for the inspiration behind the fictional character Honey Pie, and then I'm going to present my body of evidence. So, let me introduce you to someone whose name sounds as made up as Pussy Galore or Felicity Shagwell. This is Rita Tushingham, and that is not a stage name. She was born in Liverpool, so not only was she from the north of England way, but she was from the exact same part of the north as Paul McCartney as well. They were both born in 1942, within around 3 months of each other, in the same town. So that's point 1 ticked off. She was also a well-known movie star. And while she did do mostly British films, in 1968, when Paul was writing this song, she was working on a Hollywood production called The Guru. So that's point 2 ticked off as well. Before The Guru, she was in a film called Diamonds for Breakfast, and before that, a 1967 film called Smashing Time, in which she sang as well. So there we have number 3 ticked off as well. We've got a female from the north of England who is a movie star doing work in Hollywood and has also recently sung in a movie. But let's keep going. Is there any connection between Rita Tushingham and the Beatles, Paul in particular? Listen to this from an interview with Moviefone in 2010. The journalist said, "You said recently that you left Liverpool a small bit before the Beatles did." Rita replies, "They were still playing in the Cavern. I knew them, we all used to go to the same clubs." The journalist asks, "What were the Beatles like?" And Rita replies, "They were great. It was a wild time, and they were just so full of good fun and energy. I worked with Richard Lester, so they came to the premiere of my film, The Knack. The journalist asked, "Did you stay in contact with any of them?" And Rita replied, "Yes, over the years. Paul called me up nearly 2 days ago because one of his daughter's partners was doing a short. I was sent the script and I did it." So, Rita knew Paul before he was famous. She knew him in Beatlemania in 1965 because they worked with the same film director. Richard Lester, who directed her, also directed A Hard Day's Night and Help. And she's still in touch with Paul in the present day. That interview was in 2010. Her and Paul have been friends for pretty much their entire lives. But there's more. Let's look at the Beatles' trip to Rishikesh in February 1968. As we've already seen, that's where we have the first recorded instance of Wild Honey Pie being sung, a song that refers to honey pie. And take a wild guess where lovely Rita was in the beginning months of 1968. She was in the same place. She was in India doing some on-location filming for that film, The Guru. And here's a photo of her hanging out with George Harrison in January 1968. Rita says, "I was doing a picture with James Ivory called The Guru. George Harrison was there and we just met up. In the picture, I was seated and looking adoringly at him." So, isn't that interesting in relation to the timeline? Here we have photographic evidence that Rita Tushingham was in India at the same time as the Beatles were, and that's the first reference we have to honey pie. So let's add that to the timeline. But now, what about the last point in my list? If Paul McCartney did write this song about fellow Liverpudlian Rita Tushingham, why did he call her honey pie? Is there any connection at all between Rita and honey? Of course, the answer is yes. There is a massive connection. Despite being the same age as them, Rita actually became a famous star before the Beatles did. She was a young, swinging 60s Liverpudlian who actually beat them to it because she was cast as the lead in a very prestigious movie called A Taste of Honey, which came out in 1961. So, before the Beatles had taken off, Rita was already the lead in that film and already a star. So the name Honey Pie could be seen as a direct reference to her very famous leading role in that breakthrough film, A Taste of Honey. And that's not all. The circle of connections continues because track 12 on the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, is actually a cover of the soundtrack to that same movie. Now, on the movie, the soundtrack is just an instrumental. But American singer Lenny Welch had sung a version with added lyrics, and the Beatles had recorded a cover of this version. Track 12 on their debut album, A Taste of Honey. So, at this point, I feel the evidence has stacked sufficiently high that some of you will think, these are not coincidences, this is right. Personally, I can't think of anyone else who, firstly, fits all these criteria, and secondly, has so many links to both Paul McCartney and honey. And we could see that name, Honey Pie, as a typical McCartney play on words, both an affectionate pet name and also a reference to her breakthrough film. Of course, I can't say that Rita is Honey Pie, but I can just put her forward as the person I think was probably the inspiration behind the character. And of course, the songs Wild Honey Pie and Honey Pie could just be fiction, they could just be about no one. But I just find it so interesting to see how the timings all line up, and particularly that Rita was in India filming a Hollywood movie in the opening months of 1968, when the Beatles flew out there as well, and the song began being developed. If this song really is about Rita, I don't think it's an actual love song. I think it's a kind of flirty, affectionate thing from Paul. I think it's more just a sweet little tribute between friends than Paul actually wanting to start a relationship with her. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.